6 June 1944. The plains of Normandy in the late afternoon. There is a lot of smoke above the broken hedge. A church bell rings once in the distance, then stops. Private Joe Johnson, 22, sits inside a Sherman tank that is too small for him. He can feel the sweat running down his back. There is a stench of metal, grease, and panic inside the tank. His fingers were tightly wrapped around the gear shift. His ears are ringing from the latest close call. A shell had impacted less than 10 feet away, sending mud and debris flying over their hallway. His team is screaming. The pistol won't work. The main door won't open. And now the unmistakable rumble emanates from the trees ahead. A Tiger tank that is deep, heavy, and final. The ground shakes with each sluggish turn of its tracks. Joe hears Ellis, the gunner, yell, "We can't outrun it!" Mitch, the loader, is swearing and banging on the side panel to attempt to get the breech to work again. The tank commander is staring at the fog in front of them with wide eyes and no words. The Tiger is taking somewhere out their goal. Everyone thinks Joe should either charge or run away, or at least try to break free. But Joe does something that no one sees coming. He goes back. He slams the lever back without saying anything, and the Sherman shakes. The tank lurches back into the fog, and the treads grind and whirl, scraping up mud and roots. The crew shouts, but not because they are hurt. "Are you out of your mind?" Joe doesn't say anything. He doesn't even blink. He keeps an eye on the side mirrors and figures out every bump in the ground and every flicker of shadow. The Tiger moves barely past the smoke, slow, planned, and impossible to touch. What Joe does next will make everything different. In the next 10 minutes, he will kill not one but two of Hitler's most feared tanks while driving in reverse. He will do this using only his instincts, guts, and a method that no handbook ever taught him. And after it's all over, he won't be able to drive forward again. The coward who rehearsed going back. Before the Tigers, before Normandy, before the conflict transformed fields into fire, Joe Johnson was just a boy from Seward County, Nebraska, who lived on a farm. He learned how engines worked and how wheels transferred weight by fixing tractors with his dad when he was a kid. He could back a John Deere through a chicken coop without knocking over a single bucket. But that wasn't a war. That was diesel and dirt roads. Joe didn't look like a soldier when he signed up in the summer of 1942. He was tall but thin, calm, never raised his voice, and didn't drink or gamble much. The guys in basic training called him Joe the Slowpoke. They altered it to something sharper later. Backtrack Joe, because he always backed up his tank during drills, maneuvers, and live-fire exercises. The sergeants didn't like it. "Johnson, are you going to win the war by driving backwards?" one yelled during training in Louisiana. Joe didn't say anything. He kept doing it, getting out of ambushes, going backwards through small tree lines, and always knowing exactly what was behind him. While the others practiced running ahead, Joe would sneak away during meal. He had to stop and turn his Sherman around on gravel roads, learning how to read the landscape in mirrors and how to feel the weight of 28 tons moving in reverse. It seemed like terror to most of the unit, and maybe it was, at least in part. Joe wasn't brave. He wasn't careless. He didn't like fame. He didn't want to be the man waving a flag on a broken tank for the cameras. He wanted to bring all of his guys home. So he learned about more than simply tactics. He also learned about psychology, German tank doctrine, instructions for fixing things in the field. He knew the Tiger tank's weak spots by heart: the rear armor, the turret ring, and the engine deck. He thought about them all the time, even while he was asleep. He didn't say anything about it. He just wrote it all down, like a mechanic would do with a broken transmission. But none of that mattered to the other guys. They only saw someone who was unsure, who didn't rush in, and who didn't act like a hero. And in combat, being hesitant is a lot like being a coward. So Joe learned how to deal with the teasing. They could name him Backtracked Joe. Let them laugh when he drove backward through a field during training to avoid a fake ambush. Let them say in hushed tones that he would be the first to break when the bullets started flying. What they didn't know was this. Joe Johnson wasn't scared of the adversary. He was scared of doing anything dumb that might get his soldiers murdered. And that dread, the good kind, made him attentive, exact, and never let up because he knew the tigers were approaching. And when they did, he would already be going in the right path. The tiger comes out of the fog to attack. 3 days after the Normandy invasion, the land had turned from sand and waves to hedgerows and death traps. Tanks shouldn't have been in the French countryside. The small pathways were lined with old stone walls, and the fields were surrounded by thick thickets that were almost like concrete. Joe's group, which included 4 Sherman tanks and a half-track, had gone too far forward. 2 hours earlier, radio contact with headquarters had stopped. They were meant to meet up with a Canadian column north of Caumont, but the route was gone because a barn had fallen down. Now they were sitting in a clearing at the edge of a field that was half covered in smoke, making it hard to see more than 50 feet in any direction. Mitch, the loader, looked at the tops of the trees. "This doesn't seem right." Joe didn't say anything. He had already turned off the engine. The crew didn't like how quiet it was all of a sudden. The birds had ceased singing. The flies had even left. Then there was a sound, low, steady, and mechanical. A deep, constant pulse of metal on metal, like a sledgehammer hitting the earth. It wasn't an engine on their end. Joe got tense. He was familiar with the sound. Every tanker did. Tiger. The Tiger, or German Panzer Kampfwagen 6, was the most feared tank in Europe. The Tiger was more than just a machine. It weighed more than 57 tons, had an 88mm gun, and was covered in armor that could withstand everything but an airstrike. It was a myth, a ghost, something that scared those who had seen it before. Tank crews turned into quiet, stalking men. They didn't even see the first shell coming. The Sherman on their left, with the call sign Red 5, blew up in a cloud of steel and fire. It was there for a second. It was gone the next moment, with a hole in the side. The people inside never had a chance. As the shockwave hit their own hull, Joe's crew ducked without thinking. Ellis, the gunner, swore beneath his breath. "That wasn't artillery. That was a direct shot." "Tiger?" Mitch asked. Joe didn't have to say it. It was clear what the solution was. He looked through the periscope and looked at the trees. And then he spotted it. A long gun barrel gently moving from left to right through the fog. Behind it, the shape of an armored beast crouched low like a panther, ready to attack. The German tank was following them. Their main gun was still getting over the shock. The turret turned slowly. The loader hadn't gotten any new weapons yet. They had 20 seconds or fewer to get ready for the next round. "We can't stay here, Joe. Forward now," Mitch said. But Joe stayed still. He looked at the periscope and then at the ground behind them. A small drop, muddy and bumpy, but open. It went into a group of trees. Not a lot, but enough to buy some time. The Tiger began to turn. Joe made up his mind. He grabbed the gear lever and put it back in backward. The first kill in reverse. The Sherman lurched back, its treads digging into the muddy hill. The engine's noise and the rattling of loose bolts filled the tank's innards. The crew was thrown against their seats, yelling at each other. Mitch shouted, "What the hell are you doing, Joe?" "Wait," Joe remarked in a calm but forceful voice. "We're not running. We're repositioning. Moving back to a new place." There wasn't enough time for anyone to argue. Another German shell hit the ground just in front of them, sending dirt flying all over their periscope. The tank shook. The noise sounded like thunder breaking the ground. The blast wave impacted Joe's chest like a hammer, yet he stayed strong on the controls. He could feel the ground through the vibrations in his boots. The mud was thick and uneven, but it sloped down just enough to hide him. He drove the tank rearward through the smoke and dust, making a modest curve so that the demolished Red 5 blocked their right side. The Tiger shot again. The round went through the spot where Joe's tank had been just seconds before. The crash sent pieces of mud and metal flying through the air. Ellis murmured, "If we'd stayed," and stopped himself. Joe didn't answer. He was overly focused. The view from the periscope was a mess. There were trees, smoke, bursts of light, and then it was dark. But Joe wasn't looking at what was in front of him. He was seeing the same thing as the Tiger driver: confusion, movement, and targets moving through the fog. A Sherman that didn't follow the usual pattern. He remembered what his dad used to say when he was teaching him how to drive the old farm tractor. The secret to going back is not looking back. It's knowing where you came from. Those words now pounded in his mind like a heart. Joe pulled the lever again, and the Sherman slipped even further into the fog. He made a sharp left turn and used the burned-out shell of Red 5 as temporary shelter. The opposing team started to move forward slowly and confidently, thinking they had taken care of the remaining menace. How predators act when they think they can kill. "Loader!" Joe yelled. Mitch slammed the shell into the breech and said, "High explosive loaded." "Forget high explosive," Joe remarked. "Next, armor piercing." For a moment, Mitch didn't move. Then he nodded. "I understand." The Tiger came back, and out of the smoke came a huge shadow. The 88mm cannon moved with the accuracy of a surgeon. Every move was slow, planned, and brutal. Joe could see the commander's cup pupil turning as it looked for survivors. For a short time, the two machines confronted each other, hunter and hunted. There was only one of them heading backwards. When Joe let go of the clutch, the Sherman shook. As the team backed up quicker, they braced themselves and moved between craters that are smoldering. Ellis held on to the turret crank just like Joe said to. "Joe, I can't get a shot from this angle." "You will. Just have faith in me." He drove by feeling the slope beneath them. The treads were stuck in mud. There was a strong smell of diesel in the air. The hull shook with every bump. The engine made a noise like an animal in pain. Joe, on the other hand, stayed calm. He had to trick the Tiger into thinking the Americans were running away. He saw it move through the mirror. That big shape moving forward, its the turret turns to follow their movement. Joe could almost see the German gunner smiling behind his sights. "Come on," Joe said softly. "Follow me," the Tiger said. The shell whistled by and hit the slope behind them, where it exploded in a shower of dirt and fire. The heat washed across the back armor of the Sherman. The smoke coming through the vents made the workers cough. "That was close," Mitch mumbled. Joe didn't answer. He backed up harder and quicker, making the gears whine. Then, at the last possible second, he wrenched the controls and sent the tank sideways down a narrow hill. The Tiger did exactly what he wanted it to do. The German tank slowly moved up the slope with its gun down, hoping to keep its line of sight. But by doing this, it made its weakest point, the rear underside of its hull, more visible. Joe saw it right away. "Stop! Turret 9-0!" he yelled. The Sherman stopped with a scream of tracks, and mud splattered against the hull. "Loaded with armor piercing." "Loaded," Ellis replied, already swinging the gun. Joe exhaled slowly. "Take the shot!" The cannon roared. The entire tank shook from the recoil. Smoke filled the interior. For a second, no one could see anything. Then, through the haze, a bright orange bloom erupted where the Tiger's rear had been. Direct hit. The German tank convulsed, then erupted again as its ammunition ignited. The explosion rolled through the forest like thunder, scattering birds and leaves in every direction. Fragments of armor rained down, hissing when they hit the moist ground. Inside Joe's tank there was only stillness. The crew looked at each other with wide eyes and gaping mouths. "Did we just?" "Yeah," Ellis said softly. "We did?" Joe didn't smile. He just watched the flames consume the Tiger. The firelight flickered across his face, reflecting in his eyes like tiny suns. "Reload," he said quietly. "We're not done." The radio crackled with static. Then a broken voice came through. Another Sherman commander somewhere behind them. "Unit Bravo. Report. We're pinned down. Tiger's in the tree line." Joe grabbed the mic. "One Tiger down, moving to support." The voice hesitated. "Say again." "You destroyed a Tiger." Joe didn't repeat himself. He just shifted gears. As they rolled backward through the smoke, the crew finally began to breathe again. Mitch laughed nervously, shaking his head. Backtracked Joe. Holy hell, man. You really are going to fight the Nazis in reverse. Ellis grinned, wiping sweat from his forehead. I'll drink to that when we get out of here. Joe didn't answer. He was still looking ahead, or rather behind. The battlefield behind them was alive with fire and noise. The enemy would regroup quickly. The moment of surprise was already fading, but in that brief window, something had changed. The tiger, the monster every Allied soldier feared, wasn't invincible anymore. It could be beaten. It could burn. The radio continued to crackle, voices shouting coordinates, orders, chaos. Joe barely listened. He was thinking, calculating. The reverse tactic had worked once, but the next time the enemy would adapt. He needed to think faster, drive smarter, use everything the terrain could offer. Mitch looked at him, studying the expression on Joe's face. You knew that would work, didn't you? Joe shrugged slightly. Didn't know. Just figured it might. That's insane. Maybe. But it's better than dying in a straight line. Ellis chuckled under his breath, still shaken. You know, Joe, when you said we'd be I thought you were joking when you said you were the only guys to win a battle going backward. Joe said, I never joke about survival. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the hedge. The smell of burning fuel and scorched grass filled the air. Somewhere, another explosion rumbled. The second tiger was still out there, still hunting. Joe tightened his grip on the controls. Let's move, he said. We've got work to do. As the Sherman backed deeper into the mist, the crew followed the rhythm of the engine, the heartbeat of metal and bravery. They didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. In less than 20 minutes, Joe Johnson's crazy reverse strategy would become a legend whispered in every Allied camp in Normandy. And even though the man himself didn't believe in glory, fate had already marked his name for something bigger. A single act of defiance that would echo long after the smoke cleared. Because in war, courage doesn't always charge forward. Sometimes it drives in reverse. The reverser? A legend is born. News about the tiger kills spread faster than the smoke had cleared. Joe didn't say much over the radio, but word got around anyway. A Sherman had taken out a tiger in reverse. That was the part everyone repeated, almost like a punchline. Did you hear? Some guy backed into a tiger and blew it to hell. By nightfall, the name had already stuck. The reverser. Joe didn't care. He wasn't looking for nicknames. He was thinking about the second tiger. They had pulled back to a temporary regroup point in a hedgerow hollow, obscured by trees. One tank was lost and 2 were damaged. Lieutenant Keating, the unit's commanding officer, came in a muddy vehicle and asked for a report. You really took out a tiger? Yes, sir, Joe responded simply. With what? Just a lucky shot, Keating said. No, sir, Joe said. With positioning. Keating gazed at him, trying to figure him out. Joe didn't fit the type. He wasn't loud or confident. He just stood there. He was as calm as if he had just changed a tire, with his oil-stained uniform and face covered in ash and sweat. Keating looked down at the map spread out on the tank's front hall. We've got another tiger stalking the valley road, he said. Canadians are taking a beating. If you've got another one of those positions in mind, now's the time. Joe leaned in and studied the map like a chess player studies the board 5 moves ahead. There's a shallow ridge here, he said, pointing with a grease-blackened finger. If we go around this orchard, we can turn around and hold this line. It's the only way we'll get another shot at its back. Keating raised an eyebrow. You want to lead with your tail? Joe didn't blink. That's where the advantage is. The lieutenant stepped back and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he nodded once and said, You've got 10 minutes. Joe went back to his crew. They were already getting the tank ready. Loaded with armor-piercing, Mitch replied. Turret recalibrated, Ellis said. Still a little off-center, but she'll hold. Joe got into the driver's seat. The controls were dirty, and his hands were cracked and shaking, but his voice was firm. We're going to flank from behind, he said. We'll use the orchard for cover. Once we get to the top of the ridge, we slowly go back down the slope. I want that tiger to think we're just another fearful straggler. Ellis laughed dryly. You want us to look like cowards so we can act like killers? Something like that. They rolled out with engines low, treads muffled by the soft ground. The orchard loomed ahead, a stretch of gnarled apple trees, their leaves scorched from shell fire. Fruit blackened on the branches. Smoke drifted between the trunks like a curtain. The Sherman eased into position. Joe backed it down the ridge with practiced precision, eyes flicking between the mirrors and the feel of the slope beneath them. Behind the ridge lay the valley road, and somewhere beyond that, they saw the second tiger through the periscope. The huge shape of another German tank was slightly to the left. Its gun was aimed up the hill at a Canadian convoy that had stopped to retreat. They could hear gunfire in the distance and see the faint red blooms of tracer fire cutting through the mist. The tiger was in control, untouched, and unstoppable until now. Joe kept backing up slowly and carefully, 1 foot of terrain at a time. The trick wasn't just to move, it was to not look like a threat, to look broken, panicked, like prey. Almost there, Joe murmured. Ellis had the turret trained. Mitch stood ready with the next shell. Every muscle in the tank was wound tight. And that's when Joe saw it. The moment, the exact second when the tiger pivoted slightly to adjust its aim. The rear armor flared into view like a target painted by the hands of fate. Fire, Joe said. The cannon thundered. To be continued. The second kill. The round left the Sherman's barrel with a sound that split the air like a whip crack from the gods. A breathless pause followed. Then a blossom of fire erupted at the rear of the tiger. Direct hit, but it wasn't enough. The shell punched through the grating above the engine deck, bursting into flame. But the tiger didn't stop. The beast shuddered, turned, wounded, but not dead. Its turret began to swing around, slow, menacing, unstoppable. Inside Joe's tank, no one spoke. Reload. Armor-piercing. Joe barked. Already on it. Mitch slammed another. The turret groaned as Ellis twisted the crank, fighting against resistance. The hydraulics were slow because of dust and overuse. The tiger turned, fully aware of the threat behind it. The Germans knew they weren't chasing ghosts anymore. This was no lucky shot. They were being hunted by someone who understood them. "Hold it," Joe whispered. The Sherman sat half-exposed on the slope, its rear tucked behind broken tree stumps, and its front caught the firelight of the flaming tiger shell. Then the German gun flashed. A shell screamed past, missing by inches, striking a stone wall behind them. The explosion rocked the Sherman like a kicked drum. Joe bit his tongue, tasted blood. "Shoot now, or we're done," Mitch screamed. "Ellis!" Joe began, but Ellis didn't wait. The cannon fired again, and this time the shell hit lower under the turret between armor plates and exploded like it had been waiting there. The tiger didn't just blow up, it fell apart. The turret rose into the air like a discarded helmet, and flames burst out of every seam. The tank rocked sideways and slammed into the side of the road. Inside, the crew of Joe's Sherman sat in stunned silence. The tiger, the myth, the monster that every Allied soldier feared, was gone, burning, broken, and beaten. Mitch sat down hard against the hull, his hands shaking. "That's two. 2 goddamn tigers." Ellis let out a nervous laugh, then a cough, then just stared at the flames. Joe didn't say anything. He watched the fire, expression unreadable. Then the shockwave hit. An unseen German artillery shell, maybe aimed blindly, maybe just bad luck, landed not 10 ft from their left tread. The blast lifted the tank off its suspension. A burst of light, sound, and heat slammed into the crew like a wall. Everything went white. Joe's ears rang. His head hit the side of the viewport. He felt warmth on his ribs. Not heat, wet warmth. Blood. Ellis was yelling, but Joe couldn't hear him. His vision blurred. Someone was grabbing his arm. The tank was hissing, something sparking. Mitch was shouting into the radio, but the words came through like static. Joe blinked once, twice, Then he looked down. A jagged piece of shrapnel was embedded in his side just beneath his vest. Deep, dark blood poured through his shirt. It didn't hurt. Not yet. It was cold. He slumped back into his seat, hands still on the controls. Outside, the Tiger kept burning. The wreckage lit up the fog in shades of orange and black. And beyond that, the Canadian convoy, battered but alive, started to move again. They were safe now because of him. Ellis leaned down. "Joe! Joe! You're hit. Say something." Joe blinked, then smiled. "Tell command. Objective secured." Mitch's voice cracked. "We need a medic now." "No time," Joe murmured. He turned his head slowly, looking out the small rear mirror. Smoke, fire, mud, a trail of destruction that stretched back across the ridge through the orchard to the first Tiger. Everything they'd done, everything he'd driven through backwards. Joe chuckled softly, the sound weak and rasping. "I guess I really did fight the Nazis in reverse." His eyes started to close. Ellis grabbed his shoulder. "Hey, no, you stay with me. You hear me? You're not going out like this." But Joe was already somewhere else. The roar of engines faded. The fire became distant. He saw Nebraska wheat fields, his dad's hands on a tractor wheel, the smell of diesel and fresh earth. He whispered one last sentence. "Tell my mom. I didn't back down. I backed them up." And then silence. A hero doesn't return. When the radio finally went silent, the war around them did not. Artillery still rumbled somewhere beyond the valley. Smoke drifted across the ridgeline like a shroud. The air smelled of burnt metal and gasoline, a scent that would never quite wash off the skin. The Sherman sat half-sunk in the mud, its armor scarred and pitted. The crew had stopped shouting. There was nothing left to say. Ellis climbed halfway out of the hatch, gasping for air. He could hear distant cheering, Canadian troops realizing the Tigers were gone. The road finally open. But inside the tank, victory felt hollow. The world outside was moving on, but Joe was not. Mitch was beside him, pressing a rag against Joe's wound, his hands slick with blood. "Stay with me, Joe." "Hey, come on. You hear me?" "We made it." Joe's eyes fluttered open. His voice was soft and rough from the dust and pain. "Did we? Did they get through?" "Yeah," Mitch said quickly. "They're safe." "You did it." A slow breath escaped Joe's chest, a sound between a sigh and a laugh. "Good," he whispered. For a few seconds, the three men sat together in the stillness. No orders, no radios, just the soft hum of a dying engine. The fog outside glowed faintly orange from the burning Tiger wrecks, casting long, trembling shadows inside the tank. His hand slipped off the control lever and brushed the floor. He could feel the cold steel vibrating faintly, and the machine's heart was still beating, even though his own was slowing down. He looked at Mitch and Ellis, his eyes glassy but clear enough to see their faces. "Don't be scared to back up," he said softly. "Sometimes that's the only way to go." Mitch swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that." But Joe smiled a little, the type of quiet, calm smile that said he already knew. He looked through the slit in the periscope with his head leaned back. He saw the open sky above the smoke that was floating away, pale blue with no end. It made him think of home, summer in Nebraska. The rusty tractor smelled like diesel. His mom's hands were covered with flowers. At dusk, you can hear crickets. For a second, he wasn't in France at all. He was at home. The sounds of the combat faded away into a gentle hum, like gears slowly winding down. His breathing got shallower. There was no blood on his chest, not warm anymore. He moved his fingers once, as if he were changing gears one last time. Then his hand stopped moving. The engine made a noise, sputtered, and then died. The crew didn't move for a long time. The only noise was the wind blowing through the broken trees. Finally, Ellis put his head down. Mitch's lips shook as he gazed down at the floor. The fog started to clear up outside, and the sun came out, lights pouring down into the valley, washing over the charred remains of the Tigers, the ripped-up crops, and the battered Sherman that had refused to yield. Give in. Canadian doctors showed up a few minutes later. They discovered two startled soldiers and one driver who had collapsed. They put a sheet over Joe and wrote his name on the side of the tank in chalk. Private Joseph R. Johnson died in action. Later, the Canadians would claim they had seen bravery that day, but they couldn't put it into words. How can you explain a man who fought the biggest tank in the war? By moving back. As the smoke cleared and the quiet returned to Normandy that night, Ellis penned a sentence in his diary that said no one else would read it for years. He never seemed like a hero. He just wouldn't let us die. He didn't back down. He changed the odds. The cost of one life. 2 weeks later, Joe was buried under a little apple tree near Common. His tomb was marked with a modest wooden cross and a helmet that was sitting on it. The Canadians were adamant about doing the ceremony. He couldn't go back since his own squad was too entrenched in the front lines. There was no speech. There were no reporters, no big military burial, just the sound of the wind in the orchard and the sound of shovels scraping the ground. But news of what he did spread like wildfire. They said he killed 2 tigers in less than 10 minutes. They say he was always driving backwards. People stated he saved 37 men and offered a way that turned a stopped retreat into a counteroffensive. At first, officials thought it was just a story. But then they saw the wreckage, talked to the survivors, and found the burned body of a Tiger tank commander with a field map showing the exact lines where Joe had cut the Allied retreat. Them away. The tale made it into the local newspaper in Seward County, Nebraska, where it was published. The headline said, "Local farm boy turns the tide in France." His mother cried when she read it. The telegram hadn't come yet. In the end, the War Department agreed with what he did. He was given the Silver Star after he died. The commendation talked about how well he could improvise tactics while being shot at by the enemy. But the men who worked with him didn't call it strategy. They said it took guts. In the months that followed, teams all along the front began to undertake what they humorously termed reverser drills. They practiced retreating backward, employing smoke to make blind spots, and attacking tiger weak places from new angles. There was no mention of Joe in official training manuals, but among tankers, his name became a code word for a specific way of thinking. Brave, unusual, desperate, but planned. The kind of thought that keeps people alive. After the battle, a squad of soldiers went back to the ridge and put back a stone memorial for Joe's wooden cross. There were only 3 lines carved into the stone. Joseph R. Johnson, Private. He didn't back down. He changed the odds. The field where he died became calm again, with wild flowers and rusty metal all over it. But once a year, on the anniversary of the breakout from Normandy, a veteran from Canada would come. He would bring a tiny bottle of bourbon and put it on the stone. Then he would sit quietly for a time because he knew what the report didn't state. Joe didn't merely stop a tiger. He made sure that fear didn't win. Would you be brave enough to go back? Most accounts about war finish with awards, memorials, or parades. But not this one. This one ends on a slope in Normandy, where a muddy Sherman is still rusting under the weeds, its treads stuck in place and pointing away from glory. Backwards. Joe Johnson didn't written any memoirs. He didn't come home to report what happened. He didn't leave behind any letters, speeches, or declarations of war. He left behind a trail, a path of choices that no one else would make, a plan that no book ever taught, a brief moment when dread told me to run. Instead, he remained firm by turning around. It was dangerous, maybe even deadly, but it worked. Not because he was lucky or stronger, but because he realized what others couldn't. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is not rush ahead. Sometimes being brave sounds like grinding gears in reverse. Sometimes saving 37 lives doesn't look like a Hollywood charge at all. And sometimes the guy when everything goes dark, the name you laugh at during training becomes the name you say. So here's the deal. Would you have the guts to halt in a world that values moving forward? Would you be brave enough to turn around? Not because you're afraid, but because it's the only way to keep the people behind you safe. Because being brave doesn't necessarily mean moving forward. Sometimes it's knowing when to take a step back. What surprised you the most? Leave a comment below. And don't forget Joe the Reverser.